how do you stop an enemy that doesn't need to sleep? By 1944, the Pacific War had morphed into a relentless 24-hour industrial meat grinder. But while other carriers were forced to retreat into the safety of the night, the Enterprise was being reborn in the shadows. She received a new, terrifying designation, CV-6. The N stood for night. She was the world's first dedicated night operations carrier, a predator that thrived when the sun went down and the world turned cold. This was the peak of naval industrial noir. Imagine a flight deck cloaked in near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, eerie red glow of battle lights that looked like bleeding eyes in the mist. The pilots of the Night Insiders had to trust their instruments and the vibrating steel beneath them more than their own senses. Landing a 10-ton Hellcat on a pitching, invisible deck at 100 miles per hour wasn't aviation. It was a high-stakes gamble with death. The Enterprise became a predatory shadow, using her advanced radar to hunt Japanese ships while they were most vulnerable. Inside, the crew lived in a permanent twilight. Their skin grew pale, and their lungs were filled with the constant, recycled scent of high-octane fuel and ozone. But the dark held its own horrors. 1945 brought the ultimate test of the Gray Ghost's immortality, the kamikaze. The Japanese, their conventional fleet shattered, began using their young men as human-guided missiles. For the Enterprise, the air was now constantly thick with the black puffs of 5-inch flak and the frantic, rhythmic thumping of 40mm Bofors guns. It was a symphony of industrial slaughter. The ship was no longer just a carrier. She was a floating fortress fighting a psychological war against an enemy that wanted to die. On May 14, 1945, the luck of the Lucky E finally hit its mechanical limit. A pilot named Tomi Zai dove through a wall of lead and struck the Enterprise directly behind the forward elevator. The explosion was so violent, it didn't just tear the deck. It physically launched the 15-ton steel elevator platform 400 feet into the sky. For a few horrifying seconds, the heart of the ship was open to the sky, a gaping wound pouring black smoke into the blue Pacific air. The Gray Ghost was bleeding, and for the first time in the war, the damage was more than even her legendary crews could repair in the heat of battle. As she limped back toward the shipyards of Puget Sound, the Enterprise was a mechanical wreck. Years of near misses, heavy landings, and constant vibrations from her own 150,000 horsepower turbines had caused structural fatigue that no weld could truly heal. Inside the hull, the ship was groaning. The bulkheads shifted with every swell, making a sound like a low, agonizing scream. She had outlived every other pre-war carrier, but the victory had cost her her mechanical soul. As she passed under the Golden Gate Bridge, the crew stood on deck in silence. They were going home, but they knew their ship was sailing toward a different kind of end. What happens when an enemy no longer waits for the sun to rise. By 1944, the Pacific War had shifted into a state of total industrial exhaustion. But while the rest of the fleet sought safety in the darkness, the Enterprise was being re-engineered to own it. She was stripped down and fitted with the most advanced technology of the era, emerging as CV-6. The N stood for night. She became a predatory shadow, the world's first aircraft carrier capable of launching and recovering high-performance fighters in absolute blackness. This wasn't just a technical upgrade, it was a psychological transformation. The Enterprise began to live in a world of red light and radar pings, hunting Japanese targets while they slept, becoming a ghost that was felt long before it was ever seen. The atmosphere inside the hull during these night operations was one of crushing tension. Imagine the hangar deck, a labyrinth of cold steel, smelling of high-octane aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and salt spray. The pilots of the night intruders were a different breed, trained to fly by instruments alone, staring into the dark until their eyes burned. Landing a heavy, vibrating Hellcat on a pitching deck that you couldn't see was a feat of high-stakes engineering and raw nerves. The Enterprise had become a complex nervous system of wires and vacuum tubes, her rotating radar dishes scanning the horizon for a flicker of metal. The crew operated in a permanent state of twilight, their internal clocks shattered, their lives dictated by the hum of the ship's 150,000 horsepower turbines and the rhythmic thud of the catapults firing into the night. But as the war closed in on the Japanese home islands, the Gray Ghost faced a new kind of mechanical horror, the kamikaze. This was industrial slaughter on a scale the world had never seen. The Japanese were no longer trying to win a naval battle. They were trying to dismantle the American fleet through human-guided kinetic energy. For the gunners on the Enterprise, the sky became a chaotic tapestry of black anti-aircraft bursts and screaming engines. The rhythm of the 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon guns became the heartbeat of the ship. Men stood behind shields of thin steel, pouring thousands of rounds into the air, knowing that if even one pilot broke through the wall of lead, the ship, and everyone on it, was doomed. The luck of the Lucky E finally reached its breaking point on May 14, 1945. A Japanese pilot named Tomi Zai, flying a Mitsubishi A6M50 carrying a 500-kilogram bomb, found a gap in the defensive fire. He dove vertically, a screaming streak of green metal and fire, and struck the Enterprise directly behind the forward elevator. The resulting detonation was cataclysmic. The explosion didn't just pierce the deck. The internal pressure was so immense that it physically launched the 15-ton steel elevator platform 400 feet into the air. It was a moment of pure industrial carnage. The forward part of the ship was instantly transformed into a twisted ruin of jagged steel and white-hot flame. The hangar deck below becoming a furnace of burning fuel and exploding ammunition. When the fires were finally extinguished, The Enterprise was a broken machine. She had survived, but the damage to her structural spine was profound. As she began the long, slow journey back to the United States, the Gray Ghost felt different to her crew. The ship groaned in the heavy swells, a sound of tortured metal that seemed to echo through the empty hangar. Every weld, every rivet, and every deck plate had been pushed past its design limit by 4 years of constant combat. She had outlived her sisters. She had outlived the battleships of Pearl Harbor, and she had outlived the very doctrine she was built for. Passing under the Golden Gate Bridge, she was a ghost in truth. A battered, salt-caked relic of a war that had finally moved beyond her. What is the reward for a warrior who has stood alone against an empire? For the Enterprise, the reward was the most grueling mission of her life. After the surrender was signed on the deck of the Missouri, the guns finally went silent. But the Gray Ghost was not allowed to rest. She was assigned to Operation Magic Carpet. The hangar deck, which for 4 years had been a dark, oil-slicked cavern of high-octane fuel and lethal Hellcats, was transformed. It was now lined with thousands of 3-tiered metal bunks. The Industrial Noir of this period was surreal. The world's most decorated warship, still scarred by the fires of Okinawa and Midway, was now a floating home for 10,000 weary men. The ship sat so low in the water from the sheer weight of humanity that waves frequently washed over the edges of her flight deck as she plowed through the Atlantic and Pacific. She was no longer carrying weapons. She was carrying the living memory of victory back to a country that was already beginning to forget the cost of the steel. By 1947, the Enterprise was officially decommissioned. But a ship like this doesn't just disappear, it haunts the conscience of a nation. Admiral William Halsey, the man who had ridden this gray beast through the worst storms of the war, launched one final desperate campaign. He wanted to turn the Enterprise into a national museum, a permanent steel cathedral to the men who didn't come home. Veterans across the country emptied their pockets, donating what little they had to save the Big E. But in the cold, gray offices of Washington, the logic was purely financial. The government demanded $2 million to preserve her, a staggering sum in the post-war economy. The Noir shifted from the battlefield to the bureaucracy. As the years passed, the Enterprise sat in the mothball fleet in New York, her gray paint peeling like dead skin, her wooden flight deck rotting under the snow, while the politicians argued over the price per ton of her scrap metal. How do you kill a ghost? It doesn't happen with a roar or a blast. It happens with a rhythmic hissing sound. On July 1st, 1958, the Enterprise was towed to Lipset Marine in Kearney, New Jersey. The industrial dissection began. Men with oxygen acetylene torches, wearing heavy leather aprons and dark goggles, began to cut into the same steel that had survived the dive bombers of Midway and the kamikazes of Okinawa. This was the final act of Industrial Noir. As the torches bit into the armor belt, the metal seemed to groan, a phenomenon the workers called stress relief, but the veterans called a scream. Piece by piece, the most decorated ship in human history was dismantled into unrecognizable chunks of rusted iron. The bridge, the hangar deck, the engine rooms where 2,100 men once lived and fought, it was all reduced to a mountain of scrap to be melted down into cars, soup cans, and skyscrapers. Today, the USS Enterprise is nowhere and everywhere. She exists in the nameplate displayed in a New Jersey park, in the bronze bell that rings at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and in the very steel of the nation she saved. She didn't go down in a blaze of glory in the Pacific abyss. She was consumed by the very industry that gave her life. But the gray ghost has the last laugh. Her name continues to be carried by the most advanced vessels in the fleet, ensuring that as long as there is a sea to defend, there will be an Enterprise to sail it. The machine is gone, but the ghost is eternal.